So let's get started. Why did we come to this? This webinar has been a long time coming, folks. Di and I have had many conversations about coach development over the years, on the side of standing on the side of training workshops that we've run together, in team meetings, during our reflective practice sessions that Di facilitates, and I'm there as a participant. During our coaching and supervision conversations, and I might even say mentoring conversations, Di, it's my great privilege to work with Di, and to have her as a mentor, a friend, and a coach, all wrapped into one, and a colleague. So she has tons to offer. She's incredibly humble about this, but she's become our resident expert in this space of coach development. And her title with GCI is Lead Consultant People Development. And she looks after the induction and mentoring of our new staff, but also the reflective practice and supervision of our experienced team of coaches. Di is an accredited coaching supervisor with the European Mentoring and Coaching Council, and a senior practitioner coach with the European Mentoring and Coaching Council, a global peak body in coaching and mentoring and education, not just in education. So it brings a lot to this. And in our conversation before, in preparation for this, because we do a little bit of preparation for these things, Di shared with me that she spent the past few weeks absolutely immersed in this space, and having conversations with beginning coaches, advanced coaches, and a reflective practice and supervision session. So the timing is really good. We're both professionally accredited coaches, as well as coaching trainers. And what that means, and part of what we're bringing into this, is that we subscribe to certain industry standards of practice and ethics. And lots of you here with us just now are in the same position. You're professional coaches, or you have credentials in coaching. And some of you might be way earlier on in your journey, and you're interested in this topic. What that means is that we're expected to maintain and sustain our own development as practicing coaches. We're never finished. We are still both on that developmental journey as well. And so the webinar that we'll have now is going to explore that journey and share some of what we know. It's a big topic. Di and I were reflecting before this. We could happily, and those of you who know us will know, we will sit here for 4 hours and talk to you about this if you let us. It's a big topic, but to try and get into, what do we know about those stages that people go through as they strive to become either more effective coaches or coach-like leaders. A lot of you that we work with, and a lot of people here, this is about bringing a coaching approach or being more coach-like in your leadership stance as well. And it's a very similar journey, because you're trying to adjust how you show up in conversations, whether that's in a formal setting or not. All the slides that we share, and there are only a few, because it's useful as a point of reference at certain points here, and any articles and books we reference, we'll share with you afterwards via the website, so you can have all of that later on. First of all, and some of you have started this already, if you could use the chat box, and Di and I will have a glance at that and see if we can pick them out. Usually it moves at rapid speed and it's hard, so don't be offended if we don't spot you. Just to say hello. Where are you joining us from, and how long have you been coaching? That would be interesting for us to see who we've got in the room, and then we'll jump right into the topic. Where are you from? Where are you coming to us from? And how long have you been coaching? And Di, there's already some messages in there about your tweeting coming up as well. We'll work on that, folks. Help. We'll work on that. Yeah. And welcome. Yeah. Siobhan from Singapore. Welcome. Thank you. Yeah. Adelaide, yeah, Melbourne, all over. Yeah, so friends and colleagues in the group here as well, and lots of new people. I'm just scrolling up and down here. Yeah, Malaysia. Thanks, Mark. Thanks for joining us from Malaysia as well. Yeah, the time zone just about works. A bit further west we go there. Yep.
Yeah. So a few people were giving a shout out to me because I've worked with them, so that's nice to see.
Brilliant, Di. They've experienced it firsthand, so we'll no doubt draw on some of those stories as we go. Yeah, 6 years, 45 years, 2 years. Yeah, just glancing through these, 3.5 years, 6 years. Yeah, a whole range right at the beginning stage. Brilliant. So this is for all of you. This is not just for advanced coaches. Yeah, Emma, Wow, great, Emma. This is great to see who jumps into this. Emma Burns in New Zealand, developing a framework for the New Zealand police. Fabulous. Yeah. We can recommend some other people who we know are on this call who you could chat to about that, who are our people in New Zealand are here with us tonight. Thank you. Yeah, Kath, welcome Kath, and welcome to the team. And Kath, one of our new coaches, but a very experienced coach, 12 years. Great. Robin, yep. Brilliant. Thank you. So there's a whole range there from 12 years to 0 years to 1 year. Yeah, Margaret, welcome. Thanks for holding up the Scottish end. I know there are a few other Scottish names and locations in there as well. Great. All right. And interesting, Siobhan, last one I'll pick out there is mentioning that a qualified mentor as well. And I think in our work, we're starting to see lots of crossover, lots of similarity, and lots of people who are involved in both are realizing there are some subtle differences, but the core skills and the core development of that way of being are actually pretty common across them. But that's not the topic of tonight's webinar. And Emmy, welcome from Houston. Welcome, thank you. And we met on the conference. I remember that as well. So thank you for getting up early as well. Great. Okay. So listen, guys, you've got a little back channel there where you can chat to each other and you can chat to us and you can post questions. What I would recommend, so we don't miss the questions, if you can use the Q&A function rather than the chat function to post the questions, because it's more likely that I'll miss them if you post them in the chat box, okay? Especially if lots of folk are chattering in the background there. But by all means, share your views, share your thoughts as we go through the topic and start to have the conversation. Join in the background there. Okay, Di, over to you. This topic,
So,
you know, how do you see this? How did we end up here tonight? And then we'll jump into some of the journey. Yeah.
Okay. Well, you know, coming into it, I was, you know, pondering why, you know, focusing on development, you know, is a useful thing to do. And certainly, you know, as we've seen, we've got people at all different, you know, numbers of years of engagement with coaching. So, you know, we are all on a developmental journey. You know, you don't learn how to coach just in one day and then that's it. You're always learning. And so I think, you know, knowing something about what is written about a process of development is actually therefore very helpful in terms of us being able to explore our own coaching. So it's useful in that regard. But also I think understanding something about the development of coaches, it's very useful for those of us who are working on the training in the area of training coaches and helping coaches learn when that's actively our work, because it means we understand far better then what is most useful to support people's learning, you know, at different stages in that growth. And so that for me is another reason that makes it worthwhile. And then also I think that many of us who are working with schools, if we understand what the needs are of people who are working as coaches, then that, you know, puts us in a better position to help advise schools as to, you know, what is going to be most useful for them in terms of further growth and development for their people. Yeah. So I think it really is a very handy thing to have an understanding of.
Definitely.
Yeah. So if we think about kind of what helps us, you know, what does a development framework look like, then I don't think we can go much past what Christian and David Love have written about in a book called Advanced Coaching Practice. I think their explanation of phases that kind of range from learning the core skills to becoming proficient and, you know, beyond proficient, I really would, you know, suggest to everybody, if you haven't read that, it's a really great read and very helpful. But, you know, for me, I love a diagram. I love a visual. And so in my my work before I became a coach, when I was a principal in a school, I came across a framework called the Dreyfus Framework. And it's a framework about the acquisition of skills. So if you like to put up that first slide,
I'll
Chris.
bring that up, Di. And I think the other thing to say here, actually, as we were talking about this topic, this relates to everyone in education, or anyone, anyone in the human race who's trying to develop new ways of working or new ways of growing a skill set and becoming different in a particular scenario. It's a change process. Yeah.
That's exactly right. Yes, and I've seen an interesting PhD that was written about using this in nurse training as well. So, you know, as you say, it applies to all sorts of areas. So this framework puts forward the notion that, you know, when we begin in some area, we begin in a place of novice, and when it's all new, it's not clear to us. You know, we know very little about it. And then as we progress in our learning, we advance through kind of a number of stages, is what it's called in the Dreyfus model, whereas in Christian and David Love's work, it talks about phases. I think I like the word phases in actual fact, you know, better. And it really posits a movement from the left-hand side of this diagram to the right. I'd also make the caveat that I like the term better, advanced practitioner. I think that fits, it has a better flavour for me, because I kind of like the notion of you can be more advanced. You know,
expert sounds like you're there. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. It sounds too fixed for me.
Okay.
So it sort of becomes really interesting then to see, you know, what happens in each stage. And another reason that really attracted me to this and thinking about my coaching was I read about, there's an article by David Peterson, or it's not an article, it's a chapter in a book, a chapter called Good to Great Coaching. And he actually applied this framework to coaching. And so to me, that kind of gave it a bit of legitimacy that I could actually talk about it in relation to coaching. And so what we can see is something quite different at the left-hand side to the right. So perhaps if we just click on that slide, and I'll talk about it then a little bit in relation to what we see here. So typically, what we see with people who are beginners is a need to know, well, how do you do this? How do you do coaching? And people are concerned with, you know, am I doing it correctly? And am I asking the right questions? And you know, am I talking too much? Is the coachee doing more of the talking than I am? So there's very much a focus on the rules about kind of how it works, and a focus on the technical skill, which is absolutely legitimate. Of course, you're going to need to understand those elements of how it all works, and that's, you know, the legitimate focus. Then I'm not going to go through each stage. I just want to sort of share more about what's at the left and what's at the right. As we progress across time, because there is no doubt this is attached to the amount of practice, the amount of opportunity we have to actually utilize our skills and capacities as a coach and to practice them. So the more we do that, then the more we can explore different elements, and so therefore eventually move through being competent and move towards proficient, and beyond proficient to an advanced practitioner. So it then becomes really interesting to see what happens more at the right-hand end of the continuum, at the more expert or advanced. So there you can see on the diagram that it talks about the skills are more like embodied, and that is a really important feature. And so perhaps we could just have a look at the next slide, Chris. Yep, here.
Sure.
We might come back to that one in a minute, because when we practice and we're trying things out, this helps us build our knowing. And so as we acquire the knowledge about coaching and we put it into practice, we try things out, we try things differently, we work with different clients, and all the time we're looking at what we're doing, we're reflecting on it, until eventually the experience is there in the knowing of it resides in the action. I just think this is a wonderful quote, because you can, when you watch a person who is a really advanced practitioner in any area, that it's watching like a wonderful dance, because the person is just in flow and they're just doing it at this kind of almost intuitive level. It's embodied there. And a key component of this is that there is really no conscious cognitive activity, because it's so deeply embedded. The person doesn't really have to stand outside what they're doing to consciously decide, like, oh, what's the next question I need to ask? The question just flows. And sometimes if a person who is observing it says, well, how did you know to ask that question? Sometimes for a moment, you're not really sure why you asked the question like that, or it could have been something else, because it's just the knowing, the knowledge, the knowing you have is so deeply embodied. So could you just take us back to the previous slide, Chris?
Sure. And while I'm doing that, just a little bit to add to that, you make me think of the improv and improvisation webinar that Christian did a while ago. I can't remember the gentleman's name now, and it was a jazz musician, that someone who's just in that flow and knows the next move to make. That's often a comparison that's made to that. And conversations you and I have had, or our supervisors have had with us, about when you're at your best in your coaching, what's happening.
Right.
And we hear words like fluent, comfortable, on not knowing but happy in that space, responsive. You know, that seems to be what you're describing there. Yeah,
absolutely. And so, you know, can see at the top there, that line that to the right hand end, it's more about this concept of things being a synthesis, and the sense, as you're saying, of intuition. Whereas, you know, in the beginning stage, it's more about, you know, you're analyzing and planning and reasoning out what needs to happen. And that's where your preoccupation is. And that's fine. And that's what I'm always, you know, really quick to support people who are beginning the journey, that focusing on those very practical, almost like concrete things, is absolutely legitimate, because you need to be able to embody to gradually build that within you, and that focus is what you need. So it's just interesting to ask the question then, what is it that happens between when you're more right at the left hand end, and what is it that, you know, when you get to the right hand, more over there, what has gone on, what has helped that shift and that growth? And that's the part that is so fascinating to me, watching that happen.
Definitely. And we get to witness that in our training programs, don't we? We see, and because, and we're all educators, or most of us are educators in some form of education on this session, there's a kind of an assumption that we kind of talk for a living. We communicate. Communication is such a core part of what we do. We come in with 2 ears in the mouth and think, yeah, pretty good at conversations, you know. And we see by the time we get to morning tea, about 10:30, 11 o'clock, and day one of our programs, you see the level of self-consciousness in a helpful way eventually, but you see the dissonance that's created. But certainly self-conscious would be, I think, an accurate or fair way to describe it for a lot of people. There's an awkwardness, there's a kind of, and you're right, it's that rules-driven, now you seem to have said these are the right questions, or this is a framework I should use, and it's constraining, and for others it's liberating, and it gives them some structure to what they do, and then we see them progress from that. It's a joy to be in that space, but we witness all the symptoms of that.
That's right. And it's often, I've often said that it's like it's a paradox. That the paradox is that you need to be able to develop the rigor, which seems constraining, so that eventually you can be freer. So that there's sort of a paradox for me in that.
Definitely.
So look, could we go to those other slides? I'd just like us to kind of just go again to what the expert, you know, end of this is, the advanced practitioner. And I just love these. No, sorry, the quotes from Christian and Love there. Yeah, so that just, you know, going back again to the concept of people, you know, when we're at the more advanced stage, this is what we're looking for, what we're feeling, what it's like, as you said, when we feel in this sense of flow, that that it has this sense that you are together. You have your different roles, but you are together there in a space that that has just such incredible connection. And while the journeys, as it says, we might be on different journeys together as people, but in this space, we just come together in this, you know, a most amazing sense of synergy, I feel. And I think this is a lovely way of describing too what we're really seeing on that right end of the continuum.
Yeah. And I think what this points to as well, Di, is that it's that walking on those journeys with lots of different people that we start to hone our craft, but we also gather different perspectives and different scenarios. In some ways, it's like teaching. We glibly say, "Oh, teaching is different every day. It's different every class. It's different depending on what the kids had for their lunch." You know, it's. But this is such a one-to-one interpersonal thing here that, of course, it's different. But to sit back and think about that, you're actually going beside them on their journey, and there's so much reciprocal learning and development that happens along the way. If we do certain things, and I think we're getting to that point, or what do we do that helps us actually notice all the right things and hone the right things as we go? Yeah,
that's exactly right. So we thought, you know, that we just use a couple of slides to just help us give a visual of what we're on about here. So if we get to the next slide, Chris, this is a slide about the conscious competence model that we do use in our workshops, and it's just a really great visual to remind us that, you know, the learning journey we go on from that beginning phase, and from even prior to that, when we just don't know anything about it, to a stage of being really competent, and where we're not consciously thinking of everything, that this picks it up really well. Now, when we've talked about this framework, we've always made the point that when you get, like, it looks to the end of this diagram here, the unconscious competence stage, there's really a danger in that, because we can work at a level of unconsciousness in terms of our competence, but sometimes bad habits slip in, or we're not paying, you know, we may not notice certain things. And so the people who developed this model actually then took it to one stage further on. And if we can just go to this next slide. And they came up with this model. So you can see in the small circles, it's still got the 4 elements of the previous, you know, framework, the quadrants. But in the big blue circle is talking about the notion of reflective competence. That what we need to work on is developing our reflective capacity. And this is really absolutely core to our development as coaches. We'll all be aware of Gladwell's work, where he talks about, you know, we need 10,000 hours of practice. Well, other research subsequent to that talks about, well, yes, practice is vital. Having many opportunities to practice something, to coach in our case, is essential. But practicing by itself is not in itself sufficient to advance in our development. But what becomes utterly vital is that we reflect on, evaluate, and learn from the minutiae of every experience in those 10,000 hours. So that this is where this concept of being competent in our reflection emerges, and is something that we can explore as to what it means. Yeah. So I think we can dispense with that slide now. We don't need that anymore.
Yep. So
well, perhaps just put the slides on the side. We don't need them for a while.
No problem. Yeah. And at risk of introducing too much of a tongue twister here, often when we talk about that unconscious incompetence or unconscious competence model, the word incompetence seems a bit harsh to people. But it's quite unkind. It's that blind spot. It's that not knowing what you don't know kind of thing. But the danger, and often when I was talking about it in a workshop today, that unconscious competence, that automatic, blissful, in the moment, this is just how I operate in conversations now that we're striving to get to. We need, what reflective competence seems to be saying, Di, is that we need to become conscious of our unconscious competence, if that's not too much of a tongue twister. Conscious of our, and it's that level of consciousness, intentionality, awareness, that, as you said, you can actually lapse into bad habits. And the other thing that we see as trainers, and lots of people here are trainers and educators, is the longer you spend in that unconscious competence stage, you forget what it was like to go on the journey you've been on to get there. You forget what it was like to be a learner, which means when we do our coaching demonstrations and we do our training of new facilitators, we've actually got to, and it sounds a bit arrogant to say we can't make it look too easy, but you've got to make it more explicit, and we've got to help people notice the things that we are consciously doing and make that tacit stuff explicit, I suppose.
Yeah. And that's how we can get to processes that help us do that.
Right.
You see, I'm really interested in the concept of reflection. And because it seems to me that reflection is something that we just take for granted. You know, we'll often say to somebody, oh, look, you need to reflect on that, or it'd be good to reflect on that. And I've often asked, I thought, what goes on in your head when somebody says that to you? What do we mean by reflection? I think we all assume that whatever that is that we're supposed to be examining and reflecting on, it's some kind of experience that we're assuming we want to explore, to think about, to critique, to evaluate, so that we have the intention of being kind of better at it. And I think that's, a reasonable, it's a universal understanding, and I think that's a reasonable one to have. But the question I have is, how competent are we at reflecting? So yes, this, that slide we looked at a moment ago is saying reflective competence is really useful, but what does competence look like? And from my observation, I think many of us are quite narrow or limited in what we bring to this notion of reflection. That often, if we're asked to reflect on something, the most common default position that I've come across is that people will straight away go to whatever it is they think they did badly.
Yeah. You're reminding me of a phrase that one of the authors will mention in a minute, I'm sure, Stephen Brookfield, one of my favorites on reflective practice. Yeah. He describes the term reflection as one of, and he's based in America, so he calls it a motherhood and apple pie term. It's just a term that just we throw around there and everybody just assumes that, oh, everybody knows what that means. It's loaded with assumption and hidden meaning. And then we introduce the phrase critical reflection. That has a whole load of other connotations on it of being, what you've just said, being critical, identifying weaknesses and so on. And in its fuzziest sense, reflection is just sitting around thinking about stuff. And that's not very intentional or conscious either. So how do we help? What helps? I think that's kind of where we're heading in our train of thought as we're thinking of this. Yeah.
Well, one of the first things that we can do that helps is actually support people in expanding their repertoire of frameworks that they can use to reflect with. So when I first began coaching, which is many years ago now, I came across this group of middle-level leaders who all had, I won't bore you with the whole story, but they'd all defaulted to this position, looking at some data they'd received of, what their deficits were. That was when it really confronted me. And so having done some learning at that stage, but beginnings of it, about, positive psychology work, appreciative inquiry, I developed this diagram on a piece of paper and used to run it off and give it to people, where it was helping them see that the first thing that they could do to reflect on something was to ask themselves the question, what did I do well? And what was I most proud of? And I would say to them, you need to be able to explore those areas first before you go to the other side of the page, which asks them the question that if I was going to rewind this situation and do it again, is there something that I would do differently? And how would I do that differently? So I framed the question in a constructive way instead of like a deficit one. And for quite a long time, I used this sheet as a little tool to give to people to help people shift their, their thinking, their reflecting on whatever it was they wanted to reflect on from this deficit position. And people found that to be quite useful.
You were using solution focused and strength based techniques before you had a name for them, Di.
I didn't even know. But I was just confronted by all these young leaders just immediately going to what they thought they couldn't do. So that was and that just helped me realize that if you can provide different frames for people to think with, then that's helpful. And you mentioned Brookfield's lenses. So I've translated them because he wrote those, set those up about teaching. But if we translate them to coaching, then the 4 lenses would be about looking at our work through our own experience, looking at our work through the eyes of our client, looking at our work through the eyes of our colleagues, and looking at our work from the lens of, what we might have learned from literature and the research. So, that it provides another frame that is helpful, and that people can find.
Yeah, that's right. And I discovered that book, and it's the original text is a pretty dull, uninteresting looking text, and it was written in an adult education context. It was written about teaching, but it was that concept of lenses that stuck with me since, and actually metaphorically actually changing the lens. But one of my favorite quotes from Stephen Brookfield is about how it's hard to do on your own. That it's, and the phrase he uses, and I might get this wrong, is along the lines of it's the pedagogic equivalent of trying to look at the back of one's head in the bathroom mirror. No matter which way you twist and turn, you can't quite see what it looks like unless someone else holds up another mirror, shows you it from a different perspective. The other really important point he makes in there is how our view of reality is so loaded with bias and loaded with assumptions that are influenced by societal norms, the context we're in, and our own history as learners and knowers. So what we're seeing in the work you're doing with us is that actually having some frameworks, and even as simple as those ones that you mentioned there, of just a few key questions that we stick to faithfully and engage with honestly, can help just change the way we think and the level of analytical or critical thinking, for want of a better phrase, that we actually do.
And what you brought forward there is the notion that what is really helpful is to reflect with others. Now, of course, reflecting ourselves is something that we all do. All humans do that to a greater or lesser degree. And as Insoo Kim Berg, one of the great solution-focused, thinkers said, it actually sharpens your own capacity to self-evaluate, to be open, to be honest about, where you are in whatever practice you're exploring. But you've made the comment that what is helpful is to be able to reflect with others, and that is absolutely key. And so we in growth coaching, we have 2 processes that we adopt and use. So one is a group supervision process, which is where people come in groups, and we call that reflective practice. And then, of course, there's individual reflection with one other person who is a supervisor, comes in that role as supervisor. And so both of those processes are really helpful because they help us bring our work to consciousness. That's what we need to be able to do, to be able to really see what it is we're doing. So in reflective practice, we bring stories of practice to the group, and we use tools or protocols to explore whatever has been presented. And we learn, we gain ideas and thoughts. Something that's worked well, we amplify what has enabled it to be successful. So we really, with the support of colleagues, we're actually exploring our practice and taking away useful insights and ideas that can help us with that. The other one is individual supervision, where we explore again in the minute parts of our work, because the thing that is the biggest shift in that area now is the use of videoing. And I actually think we can thank COVID and Zoom and other platforms for that, because now it is just so much easier and much more acceptable to be able to record a clip of coaching and then, you know, with the permission of the client, to bring that to supervision. And I could provide, you know, stories of things I've seen in that, but I think that would take too much time. But those processes now enable us to actually see what we do. And I remember the time listening to Jim Knight, where he said, you know, no teacher can truly understand how they teach until they actually see themselves teaching. And I actually think it's the same with us as coaches.
Absolutely, Di. And it's been a fascinating journey. We've mentioned COVID twice now. Won't do it again. This has been nice not to start with that introduction, but I think that this space, having Zoom, been able to record instantly and just take a little snip of something, has been massively powerful in the work that we've done. And we've been in reflective practice groups together as well, but even in supervision and some of our accreditation training that we do, I've seen people volunteer to do that now and say, and as you said, it's not just teachers, it's all of us. Whatever role we're in, if it's a busy, complex relational role, we will never know what it looks like when we do what we do, because you can't stand outside yourself and watch as you're doing that kind of busy, complex work. And often we don't know what it looks like when we do what we do. We don't have a real sense of reality. So, and we talk about that when we talk about instructional coaching and so on. Thanks, Sharon, you've just mentioned that there. But really in anything, you know, what does it look like when you run a team meeting? What does it look like when you're in a coaching session? And what do you want to know? I think there's another side to it, Di, is it can be overwhelming. I don't want somebody to send me a video of a whole hour's coaching conversation. Thank you very much. I don't really want them to look at the whole thing either. We want them to go looking for, or with a lens on it already. So back to that lenses or some kind of framework over it, because it can be really overwhelming for people.
People come to supervision with a question, and you know, therefore we're looking at particular bits of the video. But I noticed that on this call tonight, there are some people who've just worked with me recently in one of our coaching programs, and they've had their coaching videoed. So maybe one or two of them might make a comment.
But just to
finish,
up there too, Di.
I can. Well, I haven't had a chance to read them yet. But perhaps the last comment you would make is that, you see, I find this really helpful, because when I'm working with people, I want to be able to affirm and acknowledge what they're doing well, and you know, that they're really learning and they're building into their work. But also I want to be able to provide stretch for them. And you know, I want to use, you know, like Vygotsky's zone of proximal development to support them to make a stretch into the new area. But I only want to be able to stretch them to where they can go. It's no point trying to provide a stretch that's kind of right up to the right hand end of that framework if they're just not really, you know, anywhere near that. They're too preoccupied with some other things, you know. So it's really useful, and I'm sure there'll be lots of questions, so we'll leave it there.
We'll open up to questions. Just while I want to ask Di one last question, I'm going to put her on the spot and try a coaching question on her ish in a second, just to give you time to think of your questions, folks. And if you can use the Q&A box, that function, that'd be easier to find than the chat. There's been some lovely comments there as well as we go, and some resources been shared. Thank you to those who shared some other links and things in there. We'll have a look at those as well. What questions do you have about coach growth, about anything that we've presented, about your own journey or next steps, anything like that? And we mentioned reflective practice and supervision there. I can honestly say that was not a shameless plug, but it's there if you want it, but you don't have to. But you know, as an illustration of what we actually do ourselves as well. So I'm one of our coaches, and I take part in reflective practice that Di and others run, and I'm there as a coach, honing my practice as well. Di, I suppose to sum up, and we've got that, I think that Dreyfus model is something that we come back to regularly in our conversations, because we see people going on that journey from novice to expert, or from novice to advanced practitioner. It's a joy and a privilege to be part of that journey, especially when we are still on that journey as well. If you were to kind of, I'm asking you to sum something up here about your insights, but I'm trying to choose my question really carefully. I'm even more self-conscious than usual when I'm asking you a question, Di, because you're usually the one asking me questions. So here's one, and respectfully, over your journey, You're an experienced school leader, system leader, classroom teacher before that, hugely experienced coach. You've been with us since near the start, and it's our 20th anniversary this year. You're one of our earliest coaches. What would you say has been the key moments of insight for you in your journey that really turned that towards expert or advanced in your practice? Is that too hard a question on the spot? What have been your turning points or key insights in your journey?
One of the things has been around listening and meaning making. That how do you hear what is being put forward by the coachee?
Okay.
Because you can hear at one level. And I've been just recently, that's come to my mind about how subtle that is, and what things are that people miss in what a person says. So that has been a real insight for me about how do you listen to hear truly what a person is putting forward, to be able to feed back to them, a paraphrase or a question or whatever.
Between
so that's
the words.
that's been hugely insightful. And even though I began, when I began my study, Appreciative Inquiry was known, but I didn't understand I didn't know solution focus theory and, ideas and principles then. So that whole area of that is about leaving the person with questions that just enable them to think, that you're not always looking for something called an action. You're actually loading in there things that a person takes away and thinks more about. That's been really insightful for me too.
Yeah. And that sounds different. Something I read recently from Michael Bungay Stanier. Stop asking questions looking for answers. You're asking questions to generate thinking, and you're listening to the thinking rather than just the answer. That's a deeper level, isn't it? And that sounds like something we would expect to see at that top end of that kind of continuum. Thank you, Di. And we've stalled that just long enough. I don't think that was just stalling. I think there was some real insight there for Jackie to ask us a question. Thank you, Jackie. And nice to see you again, Jackie. So what happens, and I'm reading this first time, so if I might edit it as I go here, what happens when the models of reflection on action and development continuums are used for coaching evaluation versus coaching development? Often in coaching and education, the need to quantify development in terms of effectiveness is a, sorry, please edit, is a brought in kind of Trojan horse movement. Okay, so I think we're talking about veiled evaluation and looking for evidence of impact there, disguised as a development conversation or a reflection conversation. How do you respond to that distinction, Di? It's a tricky one.
It is. I mean, to me, I'm a bit flummoxed by that one.
That's all right. That's a good coaching response.
Yes.
I've got a thought. I mean, and it's not necessarily a straight answer, Jackie, but your chances of getting a straight answer out of a room full of coaches are probably slim anyway. I think it's important to distinguish the two. I think I would say that. I don't say things in a very absolute term very often. I think there's a clear distinction between, and there needs to be upfront, either you name it or whoever's advocating this names it. Is this for evaluative purposes and evaluating the effectiveness of someone's coaching? And is it looking at measuring competence? Or are these conversations growth orientated and developmental and helping to raise their awareness of their practice? Now, there is a learning function in both of those, depending on how you go about them. But I think what you're alluding to there is to what end, or what's the actual honest intent of this underneath. I think there are different ways and different mechanisms you could use to look for impact of coaching. And therefore you could presume competence, from looking at what's happening on the receiving end of it and speak to those people. But by sitting a coach down and asking them to look and analyze, we sometimes hear, last thing I'll say is we sometimes hear the term fidelity. We've been doing some work with a contract recently at a system level where the term in the invitation to supply was they wanted coaching fidelity. And in our response, we said, actually, coaching fidelity can actually read as robotic coaches all asking the same questions and doing exactly the same things. The process is not like that. But if you want a repertoire of things that are things to hang your hat on, some frameworks and stuff, you could call the growth framework a fidelity tool. But we really don't like the word fidelity because it sounds like you've been completely faithful to just that. So I think that's the discussion. I don't know if I've given you a straight answer, but that would be the discussion I'd be having. Yeah. Di?
To me, I can only say, to me, this is about development, not evaluation, because the journey is so nuanced, it is so individualized, and how you might, I don't believe there is any definitive way, and neither do I think that Dreyfus, set it out like this, that there's a definitive description at any point. There are markers and indicators, but yeah, I wouldn't see this as being used for evaluation, that's for sure.
Yeah. And at risk of opening up another can of worms, which I don't want to use this webinar for, it's not that different from the way people who are starting to implement coaching in schools for the first time hit that sticky area of how do we position coaching in school in relation to performance development processes or performance review processes. Just about every system and jurisdiction in the world has some kind of accountability process. It's an annual review or it's a whatever performance and development plan. How does coaching sit within that, beside it, outside it? It's one of the things you need to discuss in your context. And can a coaching conversation be an evaluative conversation? I think our preference would be to position the coaching conversations as developmental and, as I said, a professional learning service. And we would say that reflective practice and supervision and coaching doesn't mean supervision like it would in a school. It's just the term that's evolved there. We would position those as professional learning services for that person, but it's their agenda and their growth. If they then want to take that evidence and use it as part of a review, then that's surely a good thing. That's evidence of their learning and development and commitment to it. That would be good stuff you'd want to see showing up in a review conversation, but not as part of the process. I think that would be our preference. Great. Good discussion.
I just wonder if there's any other questions.
Yeah, so there's another, let me see. Jackie's just responding with thanks. That's not other questions. Anyone else? We've got just a couple of minutes. If there are any burning questions, there's some comments in the chat box there as well. Thank you. Thanks for some of that lovely feedback there as well. Yeah. What else is on your mind, says the coach? No. All right. Maybe we did a good job, Di. I don't know. Can I finish then just by, I'm going to, while I do the kind of closing comments and put another slide back up. Many of you will have found out about this through social media. There's another couple of questions.
Yeah, there are
right. Okay, let me not close off just now, and by all means, let's try and answer those. So, Sally, thank you. Is the coaching is coaching the successfully implemented leadership growth? I'm not entirely sure. It's always hard typing these in a hurry in the box, Sally. I appreciate. I'm not sure how to interpret that one. Is it a successfully implemented? You might want to retype that or stick in the chat box. Yeah, I'll go to marks while you are, Sally, because I'm not sure how to interpret that one. What would you suggest are plausible development steps on the journey for new coaches? Okay. Yeah.
Well, I think, one of the things I would say about that, Chris, is that we've had the experience already with several schools, colleges. They are using reflective practice with their coaching, with their coach team. And so we can do that as an in-house, opportunity. And so the team comes together and they share stories of practice. And so they're learning about their practice, with each other. And what that has several factors. So they're learning from each other and extending their repertoire and building their confidence. But the other thing we know about reflective practice is that internally, it helps each of us kind of like benchmark our own practice. Like if we hear a story of practice of from somebody else, and then the ideas that are shared, we could think, oh, well, I do that. That's how I approach that. That helps us feel confident about what we're doing. So using reflective practice as a strategy, in an organization as part of the developmental framework for coaches, that really helps. And, doing that perhaps once a term is a really useful approach in terms of development. I mean, having practices more often.
Yeah. I think that's one of our ongoing worries, Mark, is that we do training. We're a training organization, and nothing breaks our heart more than to hear people in a couple of years' time saying, oh yeah, we did that training. Remember that? That was great. And nothing happened. The reason most of us are in coaching is because traditional PD doesn't make much impact. So in terms of what are those plausible development steps, I think that the initial training, getting the common language, getting that common understanding, but as Di has pointed to, various ways of building a kind of internal community of practice around coaching. You've built what when Christian Van Nieuwburg and Margaret Barr and I wrote a chapter on coaching cultures a couple of years ago. And one of the things that we pointed to there that are signs of a coaching culture or ingredients of a coaching culture emerging was the development of your own internal coaching resource. But to keep that going, you've got to maintain and sustain that internal coaching resource. Just training, just dunking people on something and then saying, go off and do it, we know doesn't work. So, how do you then facilitate those conversations, get people to reflect on how they're doing and analyze the practice? Great. Thank you. Sally, you've had another go there. Thank you. Success is coaching, and coaching effectively and acknowledging the growth of leaders, which is measurable. Right. Okay. Yes. So comment. Thank you. Yes. I think we'd agree with that. Yeah. The impact of coaching is when you actually witness the growth in leaders and actually they're celebrating it. We talk about confidentiality in coaching. There's nothing better when the coachee runs off to the staff room and says, wow, that was a great session I had with Di. Wait till I tell you what we talked about. If they're doing that, that's a great sign. Yeah. And then Pauline, one of our lovely colleagues, hugely experienced coach, Pauline, lovely to see you here. Would it be useful to look at a variety of reflective frameworks for coaches to use and be able to apply in their practice and build competence? What do you think, Di? A variety of reflective frameworks?
Yeah, well, certainly, it's supervision. When people come to supervision, there are frameworks we use that are helpful. One that I use is one from Hey Sun Moon. And, so yes, there are around and they are ones that we can help people learn and understand and be able to apply themselves.
Yeah. So, I think the key point is to have a framework. The framework provides that lens. That's what becomes the criticality and the critical reflection piece. All right. Thank you, folks. Last thing I want to share with you, this was what I was away to do a few minutes ago, so we've taken it right to the hour. Thank you for hanging in there and asking those questions. Thank you all for making the time to be with us. You might have found out about this on social media. You might have found out about it because you're a subscriber to our mailing list. If you aren't already, there's one of those lovely QR codes. It's got a nicer purpose, this one, than the QR codes we're all too familiar with just now. By all means, subscribe. You find out about the next webinars that we're doing and all the other resources that we try to put out there and try to contribute to the field. Thank you again in your numbers for turning up. And thank you to Di. I'm so grateful for Di giving up our time to do this. I'm so glad we actually engaged with this topic, Di, finally, for years of talking about it. And again, I wish you well with your Twitter journey as well, Di. There's somebody might be able to coach you on that sometime soon. Thank you, Di. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you very much for being here.
Thanks, folks.
Bye.